The darkness holds. Then, slowly, sound returns, muffled, distant, as if underwater. A flashback folds in without warning. A dusty street in Ouagadougou, 20 years ago. A younger Ibrahim, no more than a boy, watches silently as his father is slapped by a white foreign aid officer for speaking out of turn during a food distribution. No one intervenes, no one dares. The boy doesn't cry. He simply stares, the same way he stared at Chris Rock moments ago. The same stillness, the same fire. Back in the studio, the silence stretches too long. Chris shifts uncomfortably. The air conditioner hums. A cough from a crew member breaks the moment, but no one laughs this time. It's not the kind of silence they'd expected from a live podcast. Chris straightens up, gripping the mic, masking the subtle tremble in his wrist. Okay, he says, trying to recalibrate. So we're not doing punchlines today. Cool. Let's get serious then. Ibrahim, what do you think gives you the moral high ground on race? You're not American? You weren't in the South. You weren't stopped by NYPD. You weren't. He stops himself just in time, realizing how badly it's sounding. But the damage is already done. Ibrahim does not interrupt. He lets it sit, letting the weight of it rot in the air. The narrator takes us deeper beneath the surface of Chris's confidence, the arrogance finely tuned by decades of surviving in a white-dominated industry. Turning pain into performance, turning racism into revenue. It's a persona, but it's cracking. Outside the studio, a live audience sits in another room behind glass. Influencers, bloggers, producers. Most of them have their phones out. Some are smiling nervously. One whispers, "This isn't going how I thought." Back inside, Ibrahim finally replies, voice low but heavy. "I was not stopped by NYPD, but I was once stopped by a convoy of French soldiers who checked my blood type before asking my name." Chris blinks, caught off guard. There's no punchline. To cut the tension, just silence again. This is no longer an interview. It's becoming something else. Flashbulbs of history unfold through narration. The Berlin Conference. The partition of Africa. Colonial puppets turned presidents. IMF. Contracts dressed as gifts. It's not a lecture. It's a memory passed down through generations of silence. The lights in the studio seem dimmer now. The laughter tracks from earlier feel like they belong to a different show. Chris leans back in his chair, the swagger slowly slipping. "Look, man," he says, reaching, "I get pain. I've lived it. I joke about it. To survive. That's what comedy is, right?" The narrator observes his face, not defensive now, but uncertain. For the first time, it's clear he's not attacking. He's asking, but the framing has already shifted. Ibrahim nods slightly, barely visible. But the survival of one truth does not excuse the burial of another. A pause. "You survived by laughing. My people survived by remembering." Again, nothing more. No dramatic music. No applause. The podcast's live chat begins to blow up, split down the middle. Some defending Chris, others shaken by Ibrahim's calm fire. But Ibrahim doesn't look at the screen. He looks at the host. Not with anger, not with pity, but with the weary patience of someone who has said this before, just never been heard. The narrator takes us into Ibrahim's inner world, showing the years of strategic restraint, of boardroom humiliation, of being called tribal in polished diplomatic tones. The word racism was never used. That was the brilliance of it. And the cruelty. Chris tries again. "But don't you think comedy can be a weapon too? That we make people uncomfortable because it's the only way to get through to them?" His voice cracks slightly. "We've been trying for decades. Man joking, yelling, protesting. Sometimes it feels like nothing ever changes." Ibrahim doesn't respond with disagreement. Instead, he says softly, "Perhaps because the truth was never meant to be delivered as a joke." The sentence lands like a weight. Chris looks away, eyes wet but unshed. A moment later, the producer holds up a sign behind the camera. 3 minutes remaining. Chris sees it. He hesitates. You ever feel like you're not allowed to be human? The question is raw, vulnerable. The first time Chris Rock sounds like a man and not a brand. The narrator captures the shift. For all his public courage, Chris has been afraid of one thing all his life. Silence. It's in silence that trauma grows, that truth seeps in, that masks slip. Ibrahim leans in, closer to the mic than ever. Before his voice is barely above a whisper. "I am always allowed to be human. The question is, are you ready to be?" Chris can't answer. He doesn't need to. The camera lingers on his face, now still, now stripped of irony. His eyes glisten, and for the first time, he doesn't look like a comedian. He looks like a man sitting across from something he cannot outtalk. The producer counts down from behind the glass. "We're out in 10, 9, 8. Ibrahim finishes with a final line, delivered not to the mic, but to Chris directly. "You wanted a conversation, but what you needed was a reckoning." The screen cuts to black before Chris can respond. The podcast ends, but the echo that continues. The momentum builds not with noise, but with stillness. Every time Chris tries to steer the conversation back to something palatable, to laughter or relatability, Ibrahim stays rooted. The podcast's tone has shifted permanently. Viewers watching live begin commenting with less emojis, more full sentences. There is no more performance, not from Traoré, and now, Not even from Chris, but the cracks in Chris's defenses still fight to hold. He chuckles, uneasy, then remarks, "So you've been in rooms with power? Cool, but how do you fix poverty without help from the West?" The narrator doesn't offer a reply immediately. Instead, a quiet cutaway leads us to a memory Traoré, seated across from a French minister in an opulent chamber. The minister smiles while offering support, which comes with conditions disguised as partnership. Traoré signs nothing that day. Instead, he looks out the window at the servants polishing colonial portraits, history, still hanging heavy, on walls of negotiation. Back in the studio, Traoré doesn't respond immediately to Chris. He allows the moment to stretch thin. Then, quietly, poverty does not need fixing. It needs unshackling. Chris blinks uncertain. Traoré continues, "When a man ties you to a chair, then offers you food, do you call that help?" The camera captures Chris trying to respond, lips parting, but no sound comes. The viewer watches, not a man defeated, but a man disarmed. The narration brings us into Chris's interior. His rehearsed indignation unravels as he silently recalls the deals he took, the silence he kept, the jokes he told because he couldn't tell the truth. Another flashback begins, muted colors. Solemn streets, a protest in Ouagadougou after mining jobs were outsourced to foreign contractors. Young Ibrahim stands with elders, reading the names of those injured during negotiations gone wrong. No cameras, no applause, just mud, names, and grief. His voice breaks, but not from weakness, from memory. He was 18 then, he never looked back. In the podcast room, Chris suddenly shifts the tone. You ever feel like people use you for their guilt? Like, here's the African leader, let's listen to him and feel good about ourselves. The question is raw, almost but the delivery still reeks of deflection. Traoré pauses again. Yes, he says, often, but I am not here for their guilt. I am here to remind them it never left. Silence again. Even the studio lights seem to dim in response. Narration takes us to another layer, the bureaucratic machine. A white development officer casually mispronouncing Traoré's name during a keynote. A G7 finance official referring to Burkina Faso as that experimental zone. Ibrahim's face never changes, but the audience now understands. His silence has never been weakness. It is record-keeping. Every slight, every dismissal, every insult, stored now, one by one, released without rage. Chris, agitated, reaches for one last punch. Alright, but what's the point of bringing all this up here? This is entertainment. People want clarity, not therapy. Traoré turns his head slightly. Then perhaps you've mistaken clarity for comfort. He looks directly at Chris. This is not therapy. This is witness. A still shot holds on Chris's face, his jaw clenched, brows furrowed, something behind his eyes shifting. Outside, headlines are forming. #Traoré podcast trends globally. Universities begin sharing clips with their ethics classes. A Harvard lecturer posts, "This is how dignity speaks when it has nothing to prove and everything to remember." Even public figures begin weighing in. A former U.S. diplomat admits in a now viral comment, "He once came into the room and said nothing for an hour, and I left that hour changed." Meanwhile, the narrator unfolds another quiet episode. Ibrahim walking into a slum in Ouagadougou. Years ago, no press, no announcement, sitting down with mothers who lost their sons. To a failed water deal pushed by foreign NGOs. He does not give a speech, he listens, he takes notes, and he funds privately the building of local rune wells. No plaque bears his name, only water bears. Witness. Chris, finally aware that the usual rhythms of interviews no longer apply, begins. Speaking slower, he says, "So what do we do then? Just sit with the weight forever?" Ibrahim replies, "Only if we wish to finally feel it." Chris nods, almost involuntarily. He looks down at his notes, now irrelevant. The narrator notes the symbolic shift. His hands, once animated and punctuating jokes, now sit motionless on the desk. The control he thought he had slipped away without a fight. Then, a voice memo plays. It's from a woman in Chad. She tells of how her brother was arrested by French troops and never returned. She thanks Traoré for once acknowledging their stories in a UN summit when no one else dared. He didn't even speak, she says. He just stood. And they stopped talking. The recording echoes in the studio, unscripted, unsolicited. Chris stares at the mic. For once, he doesn't respond. Traoré does. Silence is only dangerous when it hides the truth, but sometimes it reveals it. The room feels colder now. Not hostile, just exposed. As the segment nears its close, the narration turns outward. Clips of past victims surface, not loud accusations, but quiet affirmations. A former student in France, expelled after quoting Traoré in an essay, posts a photo with the caption, "They said he was too radical, but now they listen." A Congolese widow posts a video. "He said my husband's name in Geneva. No one had said it before." The studio clock ticks. Chris tries to rally. One last attempt at reclaiming the spotlight. But how do you lead without fear, man? In a world that only respects money and violence, Ibrahim replies, measured and still. "I lead by remembering the names they forgot. I fear only becoming one of them." That's the final blow of the section. A truth not shouted but released. Chris doesn't argue. He doesn't interrupt. He just lowers his eyes, and the screen fades on his silence. Not because he was silenced, but because, for the first time, he had nothing left to say. The silence following Traoré's final words lingers like smoke in the air, thick, unshakable. Chris Rock's breathing is audible through his mic, shallow and uneven. The comedian now stripped of rhythm, of performance, of defense. The camera shifts again, not on Ibrahim, not on Chris, but on the crew. One producer has his hands folded in front of his mouth, trembling. A young technician stares at the control board, visibly holding back tears. This isn't entertainment anymore, it's revelation. The narration zooms inward, into the suffocating stillness, where words have no safe landing. Then it cuts away back in time to a silent parliament hall in West Africa. A younger Traoré is standing, documents in hand, after being mocked publicly for proposing land reforms. He says nothing, but his silence then is the same now, not passive, but weaponized. Back in the studio, Chris gathers himself, trying to recover ground. Okay, he mutters, his voice quivering. But don't act like your hands are clean. People say you've shut down press. That critics vanish, but he can't finish the sentence. Not because Ibrahim interrupts him, but because the accusation feels suddenly flimsy in this new emotional terrain. Traoré lifts his head slowly. You confuse order with fear. I do not silence truth. I only refuse to let it wear clown shoes. The line lands harder than a shout. The chat explodes floods of conflicting reactions. Supporters, critics, journalists, trolls. But Ibrahim continues, voice never raised, eyes never blinking. Freedom is not the right to insult without consequence. It is the courage to speak, without costume. The podcast control room receives an alert. A trending clip from earlier in the show now has over 5 million views. Media outlets begin to mirror segments in real time. A CNN Chiron reads, Traoré shocks Hollywood. Silence isn't oppression, it's memory. Chris begins to shift in his seat. His palms are sweaty against the wood of the table. He starts speaking faster again, searching for a return. To rhythm, to something familiar. You act like you've got all the answers. Like pain makes you right. He lets the words hang. What gives you that authority? He demands, a tremor now riding his voice. Ibrahim takes a long pause, not for effect, but as if weighing the cost of what he's about to say. And then softly, burial. Chris looks up sharply, confused. Ibrahim clarifies, his tone unchanged. The authority you speak of, it came from burying the innocent. With my own hands, before any flag, before any title. That is the weight you mock when you speak of freedom, like a punchline. Chris swallows visibly. The live comments begin to shift tone, less reactive, more reverent. A former African diplomat posts mid-broadcast. He is not debating, he is remembering aloud. As the podcast inches toward its final segment, the narration peels back the layers of Chris's unraveling. His once polished wit, his well-trained pacing, all of it flickering. Behind the jokes, behind the smirks, behind the legend of surviving Hollywood racism through comedy, there is now only a man in free fall. A man who never thought words like this would be used against him. Not by a white oppressor, but by a black man who did not flinch, who did not entertain, who simply refused to perform the same language of pain. And then, the leak drops. The narration freezes the scene as breaking news flashes across the live chat. A former podcast editor has just released an unaired clip from last season. In it, Chris jokes about a black teen shot by police. Then pivots to an unrelated skit, laughing, unaware of the gravity he'd just stepped on. The timing is catastrophic. Within seconds, the studio phones ring. Emails ping. Producers motion to Chris frantically, whispering off mic, but it's too late. The clip is already viral. The narrative is already rewritten. Chris tries to address it. That clip, he starts, was taken out of context. Ibrahim raises a hand, not to interrupt, but as if to quiet a storm. Do not explain. Laughter you never earned, he says. And with that, the weight of the past 3 hours collapses in on itself. Chris leans forward, elbows on the table, palms pressed to his face. His body is crumpling into itself. The narration does not linger cruelly. Instead, it observes gently. This is what it looks like when a man meets his reflection and finds no shadow left to hide in. Then comes the final blow. Not a line, but a moment. Traoré leans closer to the mic, eyes steady, and speaks with the same quiet resonance that has followed him since the beginning. My country knows pain. It sleeps in our walls. But we do not sell it for claps. We carry it. We teach it. We wait for those who once laughed to finally stop. Chris removes his headphones. Not abruptly, not theatrically, just slowly. His eyes are glassy. The weight has landed. The laughter, the shields, the professional armor, all peeled away. A producer in the booth whispers into the headset. Cut to outro. Another voice answers. No, let it sit. The podcast screen remains live. Ibrahim doesn't smile. He doesn't shift. He simply closes his eyes for a brief second, as if mourning something unseen. When he opens them, Chris is crying silently, freely, without resistance. Not because of shame, but because the performance is finally over. The The final narration speaks for no one, it only watches. There are moments when truth does not strike, it settles. Like dust on untouched furniture, proof that something was always there, ignored, until light exposed it. No credits roll, no music plays. The last image is simple, Chris Rock, no longer the comedian, just a man, with tear-streaked cheeks, looking across at a leader who never once raised his voice and yet raised the dead. Asterisk noted. Weeks later, Chris Rock vanishes from headlines. His social media sits untouched, no apologies, no clarifications, just a silence that roars louder than any statement. He's seen only once by paparazzi, leaving a building with dark glasses and a lowered head. Narration describes a space hollowed by racunia, once boisterous voice now surrounded by echoes. He spends days inside, watching the world digest the podcast like medicine, bitter but healing. A quiet storm brews outside his window, while inside, his screen replays every moment from that live broadcast. Every flinch, each pause, Traoré's voice lingering like a mirror, held up to something long denied. Chris fast-forwards to the part where the joke fails, not the punchline, but the attempt to own it. He stares at the frozen image of himself, silenced not by force, but by weight. And in his eyes finally recognition. A drawer nearby overflows with unopened letters from civil rights groups, sympathy cards from fellow comedians, a typed note from his former publicist with 2 words, step back. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré is not celebrating. He walks the same dusty path near Ouagadougou, his coat worn, boots muddy. No press. He's handed a piece of flatbread by a grandmother who doesn't own a television but knows who he is, by the way. Children smile around him. He reads local papers quietly. Most don't mention the podcast at all. They mention water shortages, village repairs, a local girl winning a math Olympiad. He smiles softly. These are his headlines. He visits a rural school and leaves. A few science books, no. Photographers trail him. Back in America, universities erupt into debate. Social media becomes an intellectual battlefield. New York Times publishes an op-ed. When silence speaks, the Traoré effect. A professor from Howard University develops a syllabus around the episode, cross-listed under African Studies, Media Ethics, and Political Communication. The class fills up in hours. Students quote Traoré's words like scripture. One writes in his reflection paper, he didn't destroy Chris. He offered him stillness. The phrase trends for days. In Los Angeles, a comedy club hangs a sign outside, free speech night canceled until further notice. Inside, comedians sit in the green room, arguing over what's funny, what's lazy, what's fear. Chris single quotes S name, comes up a warning, a lesson, an example. But no one dares laugh too hard. Chris eventually surfaces again, not on stage, but in Harlem, at a church-turned-community hall. A panel on healing and racial truth convenes. He sits beside a civil rights leader known for her calm defiance. Her name is Dolores Hayes. Chris doesn't speak for the first 40 minutes. Just nods. Then when asked why he came, he leans in, not to perform, but to confess. I came to listen, he says. His voice barely above a whisper. He says no more. A month later, a journalist asks Traoré during a foreign summit about the podcast. He responds without flinching, I am, not an episode. He leaves the press stunned, then shifts to discuss Pan-African food policies. In his private notes, found years later in a donated archive, a line reads, I spoke not to defeat, but to hold a mirror. I hoped he'd look. Chris begins volunteering at a local arts center, teaching kids storytelling. He doesn't tell them jokes. Instead, he listens to theirs. He begins to carry a small notebook, not for punchlines, but for truth. He rereads Baldwin, then Hughes, then a handwritten letter from his mother found tucked in an old jacket. Her final words, don't ever think silence is failure. The podcast episode remains the most streamed broadcast in the platform's history. It's played in classrooms, quoted in protests, analyzed in academic journals. Even AI voice simulations are built to replicate its cadence, but none replicate its pause. Haunting, piercing silence after Traoré's words. The resolution arrives, not in headlines but in private gestures. A boy in Atlanta watches the episode on his cracked tablet. He turns to his mother, eyes wide, heart full, and asks, how come no one ever told us we could talk like that? His mother, tired but awake, brushes his hair back and says, because some truths only show up when we stop laughing at the wrong things. And finally, in a field under Burkina Faso's sun, Ibrahim Traoré stands beside a child building a wooden toy plane. He helps fasten the wing. The child looks up and says, did you win? Traoré smiles, then kneels. No, he says, but we hurt ourselves for the first time in a long time. Fade to black.